there, and welcome to today's rehearsal interview. We are really happy to bring along James Clear, especially since we're recording this interview right after the new year when many of you are thinking about what you need to change and what resolutions you need to keep. And the reason that is relevant is because James Clear is an expert on habits and routines. And the reason why we want James to talk a little bit to us today is because the rehearsal platform is best used when people deliberately practice with it. And there are a number of ways that we can help you today, and through James' insight, help you to consider that type of mentality. So James, thanks so much for agreeing to do this interview with Rehearsal today. We're really excited to have you and learn from you. Yeah, if you'd like, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and the great work that you've done.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I've been writing about habits and behavior change for over 5 years now. I'm currently finishing a book on habits and behavior change, which will be published by Penguin Random House in 2018. And what really got me interested in the topic was my career as an athlete. So I played baseball all the way through college, and there are all sorts of habits and routines that you have at practice every day, and many also deliberate practice routines, which we can get into later. But I didn't really realize it at the time. I was just doing it because that's what I needed to do to be part of the team. And then later, I went to graduate school and ended up starting my own company. And as I did that, I realized that I had no idea what I was doing as far as getting people to sign up for things. Like, why would someone sign up to an email list, or why would someone buy a product? And that led me to consumer psychology. And so I started studying and researching more there. And then eventually I kind of went down this rabbit hole of behavioral psychology and all the different science related to habit formation and improvement. Got really interested in the biology and the neuroscience of it. And eventually I started connecting the dots between what I was studying to build a successful business as an entrepreneur and what I had done previously as an athlete. And I started seeing these connections between, like this research study could have been useful for my weightlifting routine or for my nutrition routine or whatever. And so I started keeping notes on those ideas. And eventually that document got to be 60 pages long. And I was like, all right, I should just publish some of this. Right. And so I finally put it out there after a year of talking myself into not doing it. And that was November 12th, 2012. And I've been writing about the topic ever since. And, now things have grown quickly and gone well. And, we have over 1 million people a month coming to the site and reading articles. So it's been fun. It's been a very interesting journey and definitely different than I thought it would be. But that was kind of my roundabout way into the world of habits and behavior change.
That's great. Well, great context. Okay, so now that you do have 1 million people going to your site and you had 60 pages of research and data, can you share a little bit with our audience about what it is that you found is essential for habit creation?
Sure. So there are two ways we could approach this question. The first is, how does a habit work? What are the different stages of a habit? What's the sequence that all human behavior goes through? So I'll start there. And then the second way is to talk about what are the things that influence those sequence of steps. And so we'll get into that in a moment. So I like to say there are 4 stages of habits, and there's really these 4 steps honestly probably occur in pretty much any human behavior. Habits are just the behaviors that we repeat enough for them to become automatic and mindless. But pretty much every behavior goes through these 4 stages. So the first one is you notice something. And this is the cue, or noticing, sometimes I like to call that stage. You pick up on a piece of information. So the sensory nervous system, you either smell something or see it or taste it or touch it. There are other ways to notice things as well. But anyway, so you take in a bit of information. So we'll call that the cue. So the first stage is the cue. The second stage is once you get that bit of information, you get a craving or a motivation. So the second stage is a craving. So for example, maybe the bit of information you get is that the temperature dropped, and then the craving that you have or the motivation you have is to put a jacket on because you're cold.
Right.
So you're motivated to do something. That's the second stage. And motivation is required, craving or wanting, some level of desire is required for any response, even if it's non-conscious. So the third stage is the response. This is the actual habit or the behavior that you perform. And these, once they're repeated, this is happening all day long. We don't even realize it, but it can be non-conscious once you've gone through it a bunch of times. So for example, if I walk into a dark room, I take in a bit of information, which is that the room is dark, so that's the cue. then I want to be able to see. So that's the craving. My response is I reach for the light switch instinctively and flip it on. And then the fourth stage is the reward, which is the lights come on.
Right.
And so these four stages, cue, craving, response, reward, those are kind of the four steps that all habits go through. Now, when I walk into a room, I'm not consciously thinking of any of that. We're just kind of like, it all happens in the blink of an eye. And that's kind of the power of habit formation, is that through repetition and practice and repeated exposure, your brain begins to internalize and automate things that were once effortful or once took, a good amount of conscious thought, can now be done automatically or without having to make a decision. And really, when we talk about deliberate practice, this is the benefit of deliberate practice. It's the process of going from something that took a lot of effort early on, learning how to dribble a basketball for the first time, for example, to being able, through practice and repetition, to do it mindlessly. Now, the challenge of deliberate practice is that once you're doing something mindlessly, you often aren't paying attention to whether you're getting better or worse at it. We think that we're getting better because we're gaining experience, but in many cases, performance either stagnates or even declines slightly once you start doing it mindlessly over and over again. So the constant battle for any coach or athlete or musician or anyone who wants to utilize deliberate practice to get better is to oscillate back and forth between internalizing something and making it a habit, and then using those habits as the foundation to take on new effortful work that you can then internalize again and continue to climb that ladder.
Right. So it seems like it's cyclical, because once you get to the point where it's mindless, then you have to notice the fact that it's mindless so that you can pay attention to improvement.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's an interesting challenge, because like the whole benefit of habits is to internalize it and make it mindless. But then suddenly you have to be aware of that again. And this is why you see so many top performers use some form of measurement and tracking to be able to pay attention to what's going on. So,
Right.
you may go for if you're a marathon runner, you may go for your run relatively mindlessly or automatically, but you need tracking. So, what your average pace was per mile and where you ran and how many hills you did and all this other stuff,
Right.
in order to see what exactly happened and to make adjustments for the next time.
Right. Yeah. And another dimension to it that I'd like you to comment on is with your example, with it being dark, I can't see. I need to see. So I make I change my behavior and I create a habit. Similarly with eating, I'm hungry. I need to eat. I eat. I understand how that process goes. Those are considered, I would say, needs. When we get to something like, well, in our case, we're talking about training. In your case, you were talking about training for athleticism. Here, we're talking workplace training. It's not necessarily always a need. I mean, we hope that employees are hoping and needing to get better, but it's not even necessarily a want. Sometimes it's you have to do this. Mm-hmm. And in those cases, how do those four components change a little bit? Because the notice is more of a demand. So what kind of insight do you have to tell business people when they're trying to cultivate a culture of habits?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So to answer this, let's think of those four stages again. So cue, craving, response, reward. And you can imagine each of those four stages are kind of like a slider that you can adjust, or a lever that you can pull. And when the sliders are in the right location, building good habits is easy. And when they're in the wrong location, building good habits is like almost impossible. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, for the situation that you're facing, which slider, which lever is the right one to pull? And really, this is a process of continuous improvement. You can go through all four and just continue to cycle and try to find ways to improve it. If we're facing the situation like you described, which is that maybe the employee is not feeling that motivated to do the thing, they don't have like this internal craving to accomplish the task, and probably the slider to adjust is the third one, which is the response. So I for each of those stages, I like to come up with a simple rule, and I'll call these like the 4 rules of behavior change. Right. So the first rule for cue is make it obvious. The second rule for craving is make it attractive. The third rule for response is make it easy. And the fourth rule for reward is make it satisfying. So make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. And if you can go through those 4, then you can almost improve any behavior just by adjusting those 4 things. And what you find is that now everyone knows this, to answer your question, everyone knows this instinctively, that motivation rises and falls throughout the day, not always feeling the same amount of motivation. So if you're feeling a very low amount of motivation, like the employee in this example, then the way to make sure the behavior continues to happen is to lower the threshold of the behavior to match the level of motivation. So rather than worrying about, for example, you have all types of different types of runs that you could go on. You could run a marathon, you could run a 10K, you could run a 5K, you could run for 5 minutes. Right. So if you don't have much motivation, then let's choose run for 1 minute rather than run a 10K. Mm-hmm. So what's the equivalent of that in the workplace for whatever task you're working on? That's the question. How can we, rather than write the 10-page report, maybe it's write a 1-page memo.
Yeah.
Or rather than make 10 sales calls, which is what my quota is for the day, maybe it's make 1 sales call. So we're trying to scale it down to match whatever the level of motivation is at the time. And the brilliant thing about that, the interesting thing, is that the most effective form of motivation is progress. So if you can scale it down to match your level of motivation now and make a little bit of progress, then often you'll find that you activate more motivation for the next cycle. So in many ways, motivation comes after starting, not before. And so you find it as an easy way as possible to make it easy to start. And then you'll find that the craving.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'll tell you, with your marathon example, I ran a marathon and I followed a plan, and the next day it said that I needed to run 1 mile. And that was absolutely the last thing I wanted to do. And I thought it was kind of silly, but it made me think I can do a mile. I just did a marathon. Once I got over that part, then I was back into that mode where I could continue building back up.
For any task, for any habit, or even a practice session, a deliberate practice session, there is a certain amount of friction associated with the task. And almost always the friction is highest at the beginning. Once the task begins, the friction decreases. So it's like the hardest part of procrastination is not actually the middle of the work. Like if you're procrastinating on writing a 5-page report, it's not when you're in page 2 or 3. The hardest part was starting the first sentence. So it's interesting that being in the middle of the work is often less painful than like sitting around and procrastinating and feeling guilty about it. So really what we should optimize for is the starting line. To make it as easy as possible to start the practice session. And then, so for example, to a very common deliberate practice thing would be weightlifting or training for a sport. So for me, the only thing that I really focus on is I call it a decisive moment. So there's a moment around 5:15 p.m. each night that kind of determines how I'm going to spend the next hour and a half. And that moment is my wife gets home and we either decide to change into our workout clothes or we don't. And if we change into our workout clothes, everything else is going to happen automatically, right? Like we're going to get in the car, we're going to go to the gym, we'll work out for an hour. Like all of that is just, it's already been decided.
Into place, right?
That simple moment. And I think for almost any task, there's a moment like that. Like it happens for me around 10 p.m. at night too. There's a moment where I decide, am I going to continue working or am I going to go to bed? Right. And if I just master that moment and go upstairs and brush my teeth, then I'll go to sleep on time and I'll wake up early and like everything else falls in place. But if I let that moment slide, then the whole night changes and then morning changes and so on.
Right. So let's talk about that, because I think that a huge aspect of success in the workplace is the culture and environment within which the employees work. And what you're saying is if the employee comes in the morning, I mean, we literally are setting the tone as soon as that employee wakes up, walks in, what happens next. And it seems like if that environment is conducive to getting the employee to increase motivation from the start, then there's obviously a higher success rate going forward. And what's important with businesses is to be able to make this culture something that is conducive for high level performance. So as we were talking a little bit about habits and how to form habits, I understand that from an individual perspective, but then how can we help companies to apply that so that it becomes contagious, that teams are doing this type of deliberate practicing as a habit, and then the culture is supportive of it so it becomes what they do when given any task?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And culture change is difficult. It's kind of like an identity change for a company. But there are a couple things that you can do that that are like simple, quick wins. So I talked earlier about we have two ways of approaching a habit. We've got these 4 stages, so we can think about how a habit works, but then we also have these forces or these different ways of impacting those stages. So one of the most effective ways to impact the habits that people have is through environment design or through choice architectures, changing the way that the environment is structured. So for example, there was a study done at the University of, came out of Harvard, but it was at Massachusetts General Hospital. And what they did was they wanted to see if they could change all of people's eating habits in the hospital cafeteria without talking to them at all. So all that they did was change the layout of the refrigerators in the cafeteria. So some of the refrigerators just had soda in them, and then they switched and put water in those in addition to the soda. So they made water like more prevalent in the environment. And what they found was that over the next few months, sales of water increased 25% and sales of soda decreased 12%. And what's so fascinating about that is that they didn't like say anything. They didn't, if you would have gone up to anybody in the cafeteria and said, "Why do you have a Coke?" They would have said, "Well, this is what I wanted." But the truth is, a lot of the people chose it just because it was there, or they chose water just because it was prevalent, not because they had some other conscious reason for it. So in many cases, our desires are a function of what is offered to us or what is obvious in our environment.
Right.
And so the question for any business is, what do we want employees to be motivated to do? And how can we make that a more obvious part of our environment? How can we structure the workplace so that the good habits or the things that we want people to practice are quite obvious to them? So for example, I had a friend who wanted to practice violin more frequently. So he took his violin stand and his music sheet and put it right in the middle of his living room so that he saw it all the time. There was another guy, Paul Anderson, a football coach and a weightlifter. He wanted his players to work out during the season, but they were high school players, and so they didn't have a bunch of extra time. So he took squat racks and put them on the field next to the field. And so in between drills and stuff, everybody would get a couple sets in so that they could get a workout in when it was there. Mm-hmm. And you can do the same thing in a culture or in a workplace. What do we need to make obvious in the environment to achieve our goals as a business? And that comes back to what I talked about before, which is reducing the friction associated with practice. If we have certain tasks that we need to practice over and over again, then how can we make sure that we make it as easy as possible for our employees to do that? Mm-hmm. The second thing that you can do is to track. So I mentioned earlier that tracking and measurement is a very common habit for a lot of elite level performers. And one good example of how to do this in the workplace, there's a guy named Trent Dursmid who I interviewed, and he was a salesman. He worked as a broker in a financial firm in Canada. And his strategy for making sales calls was he got 2 little bins, and he put them on his desk. And one of them, he put 120 paper clips in. And then each time he made a sales call, he'd move a paper clip over. And every day, his only job was to move all 120 paper clips. So he told me, he's like, I didn't read analyst reports. I didn't talk to my peers. I didn't check the weather, the latest news stories. I didn't try to predict what stocks would go up or down. All I did was make 120 sales calls and move paper clips over all day long. And within a year, he had the biggest book of business at the firm. And then within 2 years, he had leveraged that into a better job. And this idea that there are certain core tasks, certain fundamentals that will either make the difference between you mastering your job or your role and the difference between you just like having mediocre performance. And really it's about tracking whether or not you're doing that task. That's the thing that makes the biggest difference. Mm-hmm. So I think between those two, how can we make it obvious and how can we track our performance on the things that are like the core fundamentals? Those two things will probably make the biggest difference for building a culture of deliberate practice in the workplace.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about tracking, because in the learning industry, measurements and evaluation is huge. In sales enablement, it's huge, also much more quantifiable than learning. Mm-hmm. But when you bring the two together, and it is, and we call it sales enablement, then we have people who are practicing to get better for a specific targeted reason. And they've been told this is a way in order to do that. We find, and you're familiar with the rehearsal platform, and our viewers, just in case they are unaware, a manager can put a video-based scenario on the rehearsal platform, and then they ask their employees, whether it be any type of employee, in this case we'll use example sales, a sales member to come back and respond as if they were responding to a prospect, so that they can do that back and forth practice. In many cases, what we find is that they are told to do something, the salesperson does it, the task is complete, they move forward. Done. But the idea of deliberate practice is what we want to create so that the salesperson keeps coming back and keeps getting better. So in those types of cases where you're told you have to do this task, you do it, we know conceptually if we keep doing it, we'll get better. But instead, we check it off the list. What types of motivating factors would you suggest to get that individual to keep coming back and trying again?
Yeah, so there are a few things. I can think of three. So the first one is feedback needs to be immediate. This is like a hallmark of really good deliberate practice strategies, is that feedback is not delayed. So for example, in schools, we take a test and then we find out our grade 2 weeks later. Imagine if it was graded right there instantly as you answered the question. Now, the difference between that cycle of feedback is a really big difference in overall learning. By the time you get the score back 2 weeks later, it's very unlikely you even remember the question on whether you had the answer right.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want to stop you quickly there, because I think what you just said is so important, that cultivating deliberate practice as it is a relation. It requires a relationship of some sort. So that, I can see where we were talking earlier about athleticism, and you personally want to get better, but you're hearing from your coach, you're hearing from teammates about how your play is. And so that's what motivates you. That's where you get the feedback and move forward. In the workplace, it's very often training is pushed out and then it's checked off the list. And what you're saying, if I'm following correctly, deliberate practice, it happens when the feedback occurs, and not just feedback anytime, feedback immediately. So you continue to get that person to come back and try more.
That's right. And this is why coaching is so valuable, or having a teacher or some kind of, any person that can give you immediate feedback. There's a great story about Atul Gawande. He's a surgeon. He hired a retired surgeon to be his surgical coach and review his surgeries and like the videos of operations to give him feedback on whether he was doing a good job or not. So you can do this in any industry. It doesn't have to be sports, which is the typical, coaching thought. But it also could be technology. So for example, within the rehearsal platform, as you're recording a video, there's a little meter that shows you the volume of your voice.
Right.
That's immediate feedback on how loud I'm speaking. If I'm hitting the red top of that meter, then I know to lower my voice. If I'm down at the bottom, I know to raise my voice. So technology can be used to provide immediate feedback as well. And this happens all the time on social media platforms, for example. I put up a post on Instagram, and then I get immediate feedback through the likes and comments on that post on how good or bad or interesting it was. And so technology can be useful for this as well. So immediate feedback is the first one. The second one is, the question is like, it's not just about, you say people, they check it off the list, for example. So what you find is that often whatever gets measured is what we optimize for. And this is the danger of measurement, is that people are just optimizing for the thing that you can quantify. Mm-hmm. So for example, you're just optimizing to get the number as low as possible on the scale, even if the diet actually isn't that healthy for you. Or you're just optimizing to get as many, people to sign up for a free trial account, if that's what you're incentivized for as a salesperson, rather than getting quality leads, which would maybe lead to a paying customer in the long run. So you have to be careful about what you measure and optimize for, because people will, once a game has been started in the sense of measuring something, people will try to win that game. And in order to balance that out, you need the proper rewards and punishments associated with that. So the key with punishment is that it needs to match the level of the reward that could be provided by gaming the system. So for example, if you could just game the system and pump in 100 free trials, but none of those lead to a paying customer, and you get your bonus structure as a result of that, then you have no reason to do anything besides that. Right. But if you add a punishment to that, where it's like, well, if less than 10% of these people don't translate into paid accounts, then you don't get the bonus at all, for example, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the proper way is to structure it, because it depends on the business and, and all those variables. But that idea that you need to make sure that you have the proper alignment of incentives, that can make a big difference too.
Right. That's a great way to think about it. I mean, in all of the years I've been in the HR learning space, I very rarely have seen the result if you don't. What happens if, we all kind of know the big result if you don't accomplish, but when you're talking about specific goals, they're almost always tied to, if you achieve this, then you get that.
Right.
But not so much if you achieve this, but this happens, then this is the result.
Yeah, so you need some balancing forces there
Right.
in the system. And I think the ultimate end goal is what you really want, I think this is a common thing you hear people say, not just in sales, but anytime something is measured, is that people start to, it wasn't the intention that the rule was written for, was not what people ended up doing, right? They ended up the intention was for us to get more customers. That's why we were incentivizing you to get people to sign up for accounts. But people ended up not using the spirit of the law. And they said, well, let's just get as many people as possible to sign up for free accounts, because that's how I get my bonus, even though that wasn't what we intended when we wrote it. Right. So how do you get people on your team, in your culture, to adhere to what the intention was? Because it's kind of obvious to everybody, even though we all just want to kind of win the game that we're playing. Mm-hmm. And I think the difference there is what I call identity-based habits versus outcome-based habits. So I like to think about behavior changes happening in 3 different levels, and you can kind of imagine it like the layers of an onion. So the outermost layer is outcomes. So this is what you get, your results, the goals that you set. This is, that's the outcomes is what you get. The next layer in are processes. So this is like your habits, your systems, instructions, the way that you approach the work. So processes are what you do. And most of the time, when we talk about behavior change, improvement, deliberate practice even, we start by saying what we want to get. So we start with the outcome, and then we think about what we need to do to get there. So we come up with a plan of action.
Right.
And usually the conversation ends there. But I think that there's a deeper layer of behavior change, which is identity. And the problem is not that any level is better or worse than the other. They're all important in their own way. The problem is the direction of change. So most people start with outcomes and then work to processes and never get to identity. But if instead we start with the identity and say, what type of person do I want to be? Or what type of company do we want to be? What do we want to stand for? And then back into the habits and processes from there and say, okay, in order to be a company that embodies excellence, we need to do these habits in this way, and then let the outcomes come as a result or a side effect of following through on that identity and those habits that embody that identity.
Right.
And what you find is that if you start that way, you'll be happy with the type of company you are, the type of person that you are, and the outcomes will just kind of fall where they may. Whereas before, you were optimizing for the outcome, and then you fall into all these patterns to try to get that outcome, and you end up looking back and you might not be happy with who you are or what the company looks like or what the culture is, because we were just optimizing for this outcome rather than what we actually want to be.
Right.
So I think that's a deeper conversation about what are our values as a company, what are our principles, what do we want to stand for, what is the identity of this group. But I think having that conversation can be very important for making sure that you can stay aligned as you perform these measurements and incentives and everything.
Right.
Not just optimizing for the outcome.
How do you consider, so I think overall we understand recognizing and rewarding for achieving outcomes. If we were to change this conversation and start the process around identity, have you ever had a reason to, or a situation where you were able to reward for exemplifying values? Or in this case, create a reward structure for the concept of practice. So we're not necessarily rewarding the organization because they hit a revenue goal. We're rewarding them because of the way they're going about doing that.
Right. So I think the way to do that is to reward the behavior, not the outcome. So for example, Dabo Swinney, the head coach of the Clemson football team, and he said in an interview last month, I don't really care about the football part of it. Like, I'm not focused on them becoming good football players. What we focus on is being a person of excellence. And then football just happens to be the avenue that we that. So the question is, all right, our identity is a person of excellence. We're going to have football practice today at 2 p.m. So how do we embody that identity? We embody it by like giving our best effort on this drill and making sure that we're focused on the details and so on. And then you can reward people for employing the habits of that identity of being a person of excellence. And then you know that if you do that, if people are rewarded for doing those habits and we practice these day in and day out, we're probably going to win a lot of football games.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say the same thing for any business, right? So like, what are the behaviors that embody that identity that we say is important to us? And let's reward people for doing those things rather than the results of those things.
Yeah, and I'm sure in all of the research that you're doing and the work that you're doing with companies, it's really enlightening to see how companies are pushing forward a wellness mentality throughout the company, because they are trying to make whole people who will inevitably want to work harder, perform better, reach higher. And it's a great concept that, and it follows what you were just describing. And, bringing it to the individual level, I think is, it takes a lot from the manager and the leader, because like you've been saying throughout, you really have to get down to the person and find out what motivates the person. And going back to the beginning of this interview, you were even talking about meeting an individual at their motivation level on that day, which takes a lot. And I want to end our interview with that part, because with rehearsal, we not only deal with the student or the learner or the salesperson, we're dealing with the managers and the leaders as well, who need to take responsibility for this deliberate practice relationship. And there needs to be motivation there too. Now, overall, the motivation for the manager and the leader to bring their employees up a level is to grow the company. But how can you help us to help our managers and leaders who are who are using the rehearsal platform, or are trying to raise the level of their employee to stay with this as a habit too?
Yeah, so I said earlier that the most effective form of motivation is progress. And I think that that's really the key here to getting people to continue to use the platform, to feel like there's value in it. Let's start with as small of a habit as possible. So we reduce the friction and let people get in. So whether that means a really easy scenario or a response that doesn't take much time. But starting with that, and then let's make sure that we measure this or have feedback in some way. It could be from the supervisor or from the manager. That shows that we're making progress. And if I genuinely feel like I'm making progress through this platform, then I'm going to want to use it all the time. So tying that in to the overall mission of the company and to the overall goal, really the deep underlying rationale of most employees is that I want to improve my status, but whether at the company, like I want to climb the corporate ladder, or I want to gain the respect and approval of my peers. So if you can tie in how these sessions and scenarios, how the practice inside rehearsal is improving your status, your skill set, increasing the amount of respect and prestige that you have with your peer group, that's also going to be very motivating. So I would say those are probably the places to start.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, thank you so much for the insight today. I think we both know that organizational change and change management is tough stuff, but it's really enlightening to hear how you've created a structure around all of this so that employees or individuals can look to your resources to see what are they missing, what creates a habit, where am I going with this, how can I pick up on these 4 elements in order to create stronger habits, and then how can I get motivated and move forward. Again, thank you so much for being with us today and for talking to us. And for those listening to the interview, to get more information about what James Clear's data and research has to offer, please visit jamesclear.com. And for those of you who are interested in trying out that deliberate practice mentality, please go to rehearsal.com so that you can learn more about how rehearsal can help you to create that type of culture. James, thanks again so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.